Sergeant Jake Lawson sat in the military truck, gripping his rifle tightly. The desert sun burned overhead, and the air was thick with dust. Beside him, his loyal K-9 partner, Rex, lay calmly, his ears twitching. Rex was once the best bomb detection dog in the unit, but now he was blind. An explosion months ago had taken his sight, and though he could no longer serve in battle, Jake refused to leave him behind. "Stay close, buddy," Jake whispered, patting Rex's head. Their convoy moved slowly along a rocky road, deep in enemy territory. The soldiers were on high alert. Danger could be anywhere: hidden bombs, enemy snipers, or ambushes. Jake felt a chill run down his spine. Something didn't feel right. Suddenly, boom! The ground shook violently as an explosion ripped through the lead vehicle. Flames and thick smoke filled the air. Before Jake could react, gunfire erupted from both sides. "Ambush!" a soldier screamed. Chaos exploded around them. Bullets flew past, striking the metal of their truck. The driver swerved to avoid the wreckage, but the truck hit a deep hole and flipped onto its side. Jake crashed hard, his helmet slamming against the floor. For a moment, everything went black. When he opened his eyes, his ears were ringing. His arm burned from a deep cut, and smoke stung his lungs. The truck was wrecked. His team was scattered, taking cover and returning fire. But where was Rex? Jake's heart pounded. "Rex," he called, his voice hoarse. A familiar bark cut through the noise. Jake turned and saw Rex crawling out of the truck, his black fur covered in dust. Though blind, Rex's instincts were sharp. He sniffed the air, his ears flicking as he tried to understand the chaos around him. Jake reached for his rifle and crawled toward Rex. "I'm here, buddy. Stay with me." Gunfire roared again. The enemy was closing in. Jake needed to find cover fast, but his head was spinning. He struggled to stand, gripping Rex's harness. Through the smoke, he saw soldiers shouting and fighting for their lives. His radio was missing. He had no way to call for help. And then, a terrifying thought hit him. He was separated from his unit. Jake's breath quickened. He was alone, trapped behind enemy lines, injured, and without backup. His only hope was Rex. But how could a blind dog help them escape? Rex whined and pressed against Jake's leg, sensing his fear. Even without sight, Rex could feel the danger around them. His body tensed, his ears locked onto the distant sound of boots crunching against dirt. The enemy was getting closer. Jake tightened his grip on Rex's harness. He had trained this dog for years. Rex had saved lives before. Even without his vision, Jake had to trust him now. "All right, boy," Jake whispered, forcing himself to stay calm. "Help me get out of here." Rex's nose twitched. He let out a soft huff and turned his head. Then, without hesitation, he took a step forward, leading Jake into the unknown. Jake followed Rex, gripping his harness tightly. His heart pounded in his chest. Bullets still flew in the distance, and the sounds of battle echoed around them. He was bleeding from a cut on his arm, but he couldn't stop. If he stayed in one place too long, the enemy would find him. Rex moved carefully, his nose sniffing the air, his ears twitching at every sound. He couldn't see, but he could sense danger. His body tensed, and he let out a low growl. Jake whispered, "What is it, buddy?" Then he heard it. Footsteps. Someone was close. Too close. Jake quickly dropped to the ground, pulling Rex with him. His hands trembled as he raised his rifle. He held his breath. Through the thick smoke, he saw dark figures moving. Enemy soldiers. He had two choices, fight or hide. His head still spun from the crash, and he knew he wouldn't win in a direct fight. He needed to get out of here. Rex seemed to know what to do. He nudged Jake's leg, urging him to move. Jake trusted him. He stayed low and followed his dog. They crawled through the dirt, moving between broken pieces of metal and burning wreckage. The smell of smoke filled Jake's nose. His body ached, but Rex kept him going. Suddenly, Rex stopped. His nose twitched. Then he turned sharply to the left, pulling Jake with him. "Where are you taking me?" Jake muttered. He had no idea how Rex knew where to go, but he had no choice except to follow. A moment later, Jake saw a deep ditch ahead, hidden behind a fallen truck. It was just big enough for them to hide in. Had Rex somehow sensed it? Jake didn't have time to wonder. He slid into the ditch, pulling Rex down with him. They were hidden. Safe, for now. Above them, the enemy soldiers moved closer. Jake held his breath as they passed by. He gripped his rifle tightly, ready to fight if they spotted him. But they didn't. The smoke and noise of the battle covered his escape. Jake exhaled slowly. He turned to Rex and whispered, "You saved me, buddy." Rex wagged his tail slightly. Even though he couldn't see, he knew Jake was safe. For a few minutes, they stayed there, catching their breath. Jake's arm throbbed, and his body was exhausted. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small cloth, wrapping it around his bleeding arm. Rex rested his head against Jake's leg. His fur was dirty, and his paws were scraped, but he stayed strong. Jake stroked his dog's head. "I don't know how you do it, but I trust you." Rex gave a soft huff in response. But they weren't safe yet. Jake knew they had to keep moving. He looked around. He needed to find his unit, but his radio was broken. His only chance was reaching a safe zone. He glanced down at Rex. "All right, buddy, let's keep going." Rex's ears perked up. Even without his sight, he was ready. Jake took a deep breath and followed his blind hero into the unknown. Jake crouched low in the ditch, his breath heavy. His arm still throbbed from the wound, but he ignored the pain. His heart pounded in his chest as he listened carefully. The sound of enemy boots crunching on dirt grew louder. They were close. Too close. Rex lay beside him, completely still. His ears twitched as he listened. Though he was blind, his senses were sharper than ever. He could hear what Jake couldn't, smell what Jake couldn't. Jake gripped his rifle tighter. If they were found, he would have no choice but to fight. But he was outnumbered, and he knew that wouldn't end well. Suddenly, Rex lifted his head. His body stiffened. He sniffed the air and let out the softest whimper. Jake didn't understand at first. Then it hit him. The enemy was coming right toward them. Panic shot through him. His fingers tightened around Rex's harness. "We have to move, buddy," he whispered. Rex stood up, his nose twitching as he turned his head. He took a slow step forward, then another. He was leading Jake again. Even without sight, Rex knew the safest path. Jake trusted him. He had no other choice. He followed Rex, moving carefully, silently. The smoke from the explosion still hung in the air, making it harder to see. But it also gave them cover. Step by step, they moved through the wreckage. Every sound felt louder. The crunch of Jake's boots, the rustling of his gear. He prayed the enemy wouldn't hear them. Then, a sudden noise. A radio crackled nearby. A deep voice spoke in a language Jake didn't understand. It was the enemy. They were checking the area. Jake froze. Rex stopped too. The dog's ears twitched, his nose sniffing the air. He could sense the danger. Jake's heart pounded. He slowly turned his head and saw a shadow moving through the smoke. A soldier. The enemy was just a few feet away. If he turned his head, he would see them. Jake held his breath. He gripped his rifle, ready to fight if he had to. But then, Rex did something incredible. The dog lowered his body and pressed his side against Jake's leg, forcing Jake to crouch even lower. Then Rex slowly shifted his paws, guiding Jake backward. He was leading him away without making a sound. Jake understood. Rex was using his instincts to keep them hidden. Slowly, carefully, they backed up behind a large, broken vehicle. They crouched low, staying completely still. Jake listened. The soldier's footsteps got closer, then stopped. Silence. Jake's fingers tightened on his weapon. If they were found, there would be no escape. Then, after a few seconds, the footsteps moved away. The soldier walked past them, disappearing into the smoke. Jake let out a quiet breath. He turned to Rex and whispered, "You're amazing, buddy." Rex wagged his tail once, silently. He knew they weren't safe yet. Jake looked around. The enemy was still searching. They had to keep moving. He patted Rex gently. "All right, lead the way." Rex lifted his head, sniffed the air, and took a step forward. Jake followed his blind hero once again. Jake followed Rex through the smoke, his heart racing. His wound throbbed, and his legs felt weak. But he couldn't stop now. The enemy was still searching, and if they found him, there would be no escape. Rex moved with careful steps, his nose sniffing the air, his ears twitching. Though blind, he seemed to know exactly where to go. Jake didn't question it. He trusted his dog more than anything. The sound of voices made Jake freeze. He pressed himself against a broken truck, pulling Rex close. Enemy soldiers were nearby. Too close. Jake's breathing slowed. His grip on his rifle tightened. He couldn't fight them all, and running would only make noise. He had to think fast. Rex suddenly lifted his head. His body tensed, and he turned sharply to the right. Then, without hesitation, he started moving. Jake hesitated. "Rex, wait." But Rex didn't stop. He pulled Jake's sleeve with his teeth. He wanted Jake to follow. Jake's mind raced. Could he trust Rex's instincts? Then he heard footsteps. The enemy was coming. He had no choice. "All right, buddy. I'm with you," Jake whispered. He followed Rex through the wreckage, moving as fast as he could without making noise. The ground was uneven, filled with broken metal and burning debris. Smoke stung Jake's eyes, making it harder to see. Suddenly, Rex stopped. His body stiffened. His nose twitched wildly. Jake crouched beside him. "What is it, boy?" Then, he saw it. Just a few feet ahead, the ground dropped into a deep ravine. The explosion from earlier had created a massive gap in the earth. If they had taken one more step, they would have fallen. Jake's chest tightened. Rex had saved him again. He looked back. The voices were getting closer. He could hear the enemy soldiers talking, searching. They were trapped. If they stayed, they would be caught. If they moved forward, they would fall. Jake's mind raced. There had to be a way out. Then he saw it, a narrow ledge running along the side of the ravine. It wasn't wide, and one wrong step would send them falling. But it was their only chance. He looked at Rex. "Think you can do this, buddy?" Rex's ears perked up. He took a step forward, sniffing the ground. Then, slowly, carefully, he stepped onto the ledge. Jake's breath caught in his throat. Rex was blind. How was he doing this? But Rex moved confidently, placing each paw carefully, trusting his other senses. Jake swallowed hard. If Rex could do it, so could he. Slowly, he stepped onto the ledge. The ground felt unsteady beneath his boots. His heart pounded as he moved along the narrow path, following his brave dog. The enemy voices faded behind them. The farther they moved, the safer they became. Finally, after what felt like forever, they reached solid ground on the other side. Jake collapsed onto his knees, breathing hard. He looked at Rex in disbelief. "You're incredible, buddy," he whispered, scratching Rex's ears. Rex wagged his tail, happy to be by Jake's side. Jake looked around. They had escaped for now, but the journey wasn't over. They still had to find their way back to safety. He stood up, gripping Rex's harness. "All right, boy. Lead the way." Once again, Rex lifted his head, sniffed the air, and took a step forward. Jake followed. Jake wiped sweat from his forehead as he followed Rex through the rocky terrain. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows over the desert. The air was dry, and every breath burned his throat. His injured arm ached, but he ignored the pain. They had to keep moving. Rex led the way, sniffing the ground carefully. Though he was blind, his instincts were sharper than ever. He stopped every few feet, listening, checking for danger. Jake trusted him completely. But they weren't safe yet. The enemy was still searching. And now, there was another problem. Jake glanced at the sky. Night was coming. It would soon be too dark to see. They needed to find shelter before it became impossible to move. But they were still deep in enemy territory, far from their base. Jake sighed. "We need a plan, buddy." Rex wagged his tail slightly, as if he understood. Then, suddenly, his body tensed. His ears perked up, and he let out a soft growl. Jake froze. "What is it?" Rex sniffed the air and turned his head sharply to the right. He let out another growl, low and deep. Jake followed his gaze, and his heart stopped. A soldier, not one of theirs. An enemy scout, standing near a broken vehicle, scanning the area. If he spotted them, they'd be in big trouble. Jake's mind raced. They had two choices, hide or fight. He slowly crouched behind a large rock, pulling Rex close. His heart pounded in his chest. The soldier was only a few yards away. If he took one step in their direction, he would see them. Jake held his breath. "Please don't look this way." The soldier muttered something into his radio. Then, to Jake's horror, he turned toward them. Jake's grip tightened on his rifle. He didn't want to fight, but if the soldier raised his weapon, he'd have no choice. Then, Rex did something shocking. Before Jake could react, Rex let out a sharp bark and ran forward, straight toward the soldier. "Rex!" "No," Jake whispered harshly. But Rex wasn't attacking. He was distracting. The soldier flinched at the sudden sound. He turned, raising his rifle, but too late. Rex dashed around him, moving so quickly the man lost focus. Jake didn't waste the chance. He moved fast, grabbing a small rock and tossing it to the side. It clattered against metal, making a loud noise. The soldier snapped his head toward the sound, thinking someone was there. Rex ran back to Jake's side, pressing against his leg. Jake didn't need to be told twice. They ran. He sprinted behind a pile of debris, his breath heavy. He could hear the soldiers' confused footsteps. He didn't know where they were anymore. Jake exhaled in relief. He looked down at Rex, shaking his head. "You're crazy, buddy." Rex wagged his tail. Jake ruffled his fur. But it worked. They had escaped again, but they couldn't stop now. They had to find their way back before it was too dark to move. Jake took a deep breath. "Come on, boy. Let's get home." Rex lifted his head, sniffed the air, and took a step forward. Jake followed. The night was closing in fast. The sun had disappeared behind the mountains, and the sky turned dark. The desert air was cooling, but Jake's body was drenched in sweat. His heart pounded as he followed Rex through the uneven ground. His injured arm ached, but he had no time to rest. They were still deep in enemy territory. Rex moved with confidence, sniffing the ground carefully. Though he was blind, he sensed everything: danger, direction, and even Jake's exhaustion. He paused and nudged Jake's leg, as if checking on him. "I'm okay, buddy," Jake whispered. He wasn't, but they had to keep going. Then, a sound in the distance. Voices, footsteps, enemy soldiers. Jake's stomach tightened. They were being followed. He crouched low, pressing his back against a large rock. Rex did the same, his ears twitching. Jake held his breath and listened. The voices were getting closer. Panic shot through him. They had to escape. Fast. He scanned the area. The terrain was rough, filled with sharp rocks and deep trenches. There was nowhere to hide. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw something. A small cave in the side of a hill. It wasn't big, but it might be enough to keep them hidden. He looked at Rex. "Come on, buddy. This way." Rex followed as Jake moved quickly toward the cave. The ground was uneven, and every step felt dangerous. One wrong move, and they could fall. The voices grew louder. Jake's chest tightened. They were running out of time. Finally, they reached the cave. Jake crawled inside, pulling Rex with him. They were hidden, just in time. From inside the cave, Jake could see the enemy soldiers moving through the area. Their flashlights flickered in the darkness, scanning the ground. Jake held his breath. If they looked inside the cave, it would be over. Rex stayed completely still. His body was tense, his ears listening carefully. Jake whispered, "Good boy." They waited in silence. The soldiers moved closer. Jake's hands tightened into fists. Then, a sudden noise in the distance. A loud explosion echoed through the night. The soldiers turned their heads toward the sound. Jake's heart leaped. A distraction. The soldiers spoke quickly to each other. Then, after a few tense seconds, they turned and ran toward the explosion. Jake exhaled in relief. He slumped against the cave wall, his body shaking. He looked down at Rex. "That was close, buddy." Rex wagged his tail slightly, as if to say, "We made it." But Jake knew they couldn't stay there forever. The enemy was still nearby, and they were still lost. He took a deep breath. "All right, boy. We have to move." Rex lifted his head, ready to go. Jake crawled out of the cave, checking the area. The enemy was gone, at least for now. He stood up, gripping Rex's harness. "Lead the way, buddy." Rex sniffed the air, took a careful step forward, and began to walk. Jake followed his blind hero into the night. Jake's legs felt heavy as he followed Rex through the darkness. His body ached, his injured arm throbbed, but he didn't stop. They were close. Somewhere beyond the hills, their base waited. Safety. Rescue. But first, they had to make it there alive. Rex moved with confidence, his nose sniffing the air. Though blind, he knew where to go. He could sense danger. And right now, danger was near. Jake glanced over his shoulder. The enemy was still searching. Their voices carried through the night, their flashlights flickering in the distance. His heart pounded. They had to stay ahead. Rex suddenly stopped. His ears twitched. His body tensed. Jake froze. "What is it, boy?" he whispered. Rex lifted his nose, sniffing the air. Then, without warning, he pulled Jake sharply to the right. Jake stumbled but followed. He trusted Rex. Then, a gunshot rang out. Jake's stomach dropped. They had been spotted. Voices shouted behind them. Flashlights swung wildly. Footsteps pounded against the ground. The enemy was chasing them. Jake gritted his teeth. "Come on, buddy. We have to run." Rex didn't need to be told twice. He took off, his paws moving fast over the rocky ground. Jake ran after him, his breath coming in short gasps. His injured arm burned, but he pushed through the pain. He couldn't slow down. More gunshots rang out. Dirt kicked up near Jake's feet, too close. Rex swerved, leading Jake toward a dry riverbed. The terrain was rough, filled with rocks and loose sand. It would slow them down, but it would also slow the enemy. Jake followed Rex into the riverbed. His boots slipped on the sand, but he kept running. The enemy shouted behind them. Their flashlights flickered at the top of the hill. They were hesitating. Jake realized why. The river was dangerous. One wrong step could send them tumbling. This was their chance. He turned to Rex. "Keep going, buddy. You're doing great." Rex wagged his tail once but didn't stop. He kept moving, his nose leading the way. Jake's lungs burned. His body screamed for rest, but he ignored it. He had to keep up. Then, he saw it. A ridge ahead. If they could climb it, they could disappear into the hills. They would be safe. Jake's heart leaped. They were going to make it. But then, Rex stopped. Jake almost crashed into him. "What's wrong, buddy?" Rex sniffed the ground, then let out a low whimper. Jake's stomach tightened. Something was ahead. He squinted into the darkness. At first, he saw nothing. Just rocks and sand. Then, movement. Jake's blood ran cold. A soldier. Not just any soldier. An enemy scout. Waiting. Jake's mind raced. They had been tricked. The enemy was smarter than he thought. The soldier raised his weapon. Jake had seconds to react. But before he could move, Rex did something incredible. The blind dog leaped forward, barking loudly. A distraction. The soldier flinched, startled. His focus broke for just a moment. But that was all Jake needed. Jake dove forward, grabbing a handful of sand. With all his strength, he threw it into the soldier's face. The man stumbled back, coughing, wiping at his eyes. Jake didn't wait. He grabbed Rex's harness. "Go, boy. Run." Rex took off. Jake followed, heart pounding. They scrambled up the ridge, slipping, clawing their way to the top. Behind them, the soldier shouted, but he was too slow. Jake and Rex disappeared over the hill, into the safety of the night. Jake's chest heaved as he reached the top of the ridge. His legs burned, his injured arm ached, but he didn't care. They had made it. Rex stood beside him, ears twitching, body tense. Though blind, he sensed the change. The danger was behind them. They were safe. Jake looked ahead. In the distance, he saw something that made his heart leap. A flare in the sky. Their base. Relief washed over him. "We're almost home, buddy," he whispered. Rex wagged his tail. Jake reached for his radio. His hand shook as he pressed the button. "This is Sergeant Jake Porter. I'm alive. I have Rex. We need pickup." Static filled the air. Then, a voice. "Jake, you're alive? Stay put. We're coming for you." Jake closed his eyes. They were going to be okay. Minutes felt like hours as they waited. Jake sank to the ground, running his fingers through Rex's fur. "You saved me, buddy." Over and over again. Rex licked his hand, his tail thumping weakly. Then, in the distance, a helicopter. Jake stood, waving his arms. The bright spotlight cut through the darkness, locking onto them. The wind whipped against his face as the helicopter descended. They were going home. Days later, Jake sat on a hospital bed, his injured arm wrapped in bandages. His body was healing, but his heart felt full. He was alive, and it was all because of Rex. A knock on the door made him turn. His commander walked in, smiling. "Porter, you made it." Jake nodded. "Not alone, sir." He looked down at Rex, who lay beside him. The blind dog lifted his head, ears perked up. The commander stepped forward. "Rex is a hero." He held something in his hands. A medal. Jake's breath caught. "Sir." The commander knelt beside Rex, gently placing the medal on his collar. "For bravery in the face of danger." Jake's eyes burned. He stroked Rex's fur. "You earned it, buddy." The room filled with applause as soldiers gathered at the door, cheering for Rex. The blind dog wagged his tail, his head held high. He might not see the world, but today, the world saw him. Jake smiled, ruffling Rex's ears. "You're my hero, boy." Rex let out a happy bark. They were home.